Welcome everyone, I'm Philippa Jefferies and I'm here with Hans Christian Rudolph, also from Cybersecurity Magazine. And today we're talking with Sandeep Shukla, Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology and Joint Coordinator for the C3i Center and the National Blockchain Project at IIT Kanpur. He recently co-edited a book titled Implementing Enterprise Cybersecurity with Open Source Software and Standard Architecture. And it's this topic of open source software for cybersecurity that we're discussing today, how to use it, why it's used, and the security implications, and so on. So thank you, Sandeep, for joining us today. And to start the conversation, I guess, Sandeep, how important do you think open source software kind of is for cybersecurity globally?
Yeah, so the situation is such that the cybersecurity tools that are available in the market are quite expensive.
Sure.
And being expensive, it is very hard for smaller companies. And in India, there is a huge medium and small scale industries, but they're also targeted, especially with the ransomware situation in the world. They are being targeted heavily. And because of that, we decided that we should help them in figuring out how to use open source tools and technology to actually, fortify their systems. So I think for them it is very important. For research also it is quite important because many times educational institutes cannot afford the price points that are there for this kind of tools. And we also see a lot of marketing about additional bells and whistles that may or may not be required for somebody who is a bit, experienced with cybersecurity tools and techniques. So therefore, open source is important, and there are lots of tools that are available for free that one can use. Of course, I'll talk about what are the risks of doing so, but yeah, I mean, this is very important, I think, for smaller scale industries with low revenues and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, you're touching on an important point there that I would imagine the overall landscape of open source security tools is quite broad. Can you give us a rough overview, like what kind of tools are available? In what areas can open source add the biggest benefit here?
Right. So, well, some of the VAPT tools, for example, the Kali Linux and Metasploit has a version that is open, at least for use. The other thing is that hardening tools like operating system hardening tools, especially in Linux, they're available. The biggest tool, the best tools that I like the most in open source is the network intrusion tools like Snort or Zeek. I also like the host intrusion detection tool, Waza. And you can also get some versions of Splunk, or you can also use the Kibana and Elastic set of tools that kind of helps you to create a kind of a poor man's SOC. Cyber Operation Center very easily, giving you visibility into the network traffic and visibility of what's happening in your hosts or end devices. That is file integrity violation or existence of rootkits or various kinds of other events, even performance changes. This kind of things can be easily obtained through these tools. And then there are also some tools that are not necessarily very well known, like for example, if you take Barb Suite, for example, that's pretty. You have to pay for it unless you get a limited version. But if you take WoWASP Zap tool, for example, for intercepting web traffic, that is open source. There are several other open source tools for web penetration. The application security also, there are a number of tools like SAST and DAST tools that are available in open source. I haven't seen a tool that is for risk assessment, assistant to risk evaluators in the open source, but I hope that will also either that is already available. I haven't looked enough, or that should be available soon. So I think there are a number of tools that you can rely on.
Okay, and does open source kind of lend itself to any particular types of tools in particular? Like, do you see certain tools in one area a lot are open source, or is it kind of there's now open source software for the majority of tools that you would need?
Yeah, so I think one can actually create a pretty good security posture with open source tools. And there, for example, for authentication, authorization, also could actually rely on Google Authenticator for two-factor authentication. You can actually, but the asset management and asset monitoring tools are not there. But you can, once you have the right set of assets, you can probably quickly hook up a tool to actually create that database, update that database, and also compare vulnerability listing of that particular asset with the version number, etc. There is OSCAP, the OpenSCAP tool that is available. You can use OpenSCAP to actually do quite a bit of benchmarking. There are also free benchmarking, the baseline that are defined by the US Department of Defense, which are available for free for various versions of Linux or Chrome or Firefox and various things. Those are very useful for example, checking for configuration problems or existing vulnerability that has not been patched, etc. So I think the benefits are plenty, right? So one of the benefits for this open source tools is that you can also modify it if you want to, if it doesn't exactly suit your purpose. Another thing is that you can integrate. So usually many vendors, they actually have a whole suite of tools, and you cannot integrate them easily with another vendor to get a vendor locked-in, etc. Although some of them are now exposing APIs, etc. So there are some data standards that are coming up. But if the open source tools with a good programmer, cybersecurity expert who also can do programming, you can actually make a very a good integrated solution. And that's what we actually try to show in our book, that these are all the things that you can do with just open source tools.
All right. Yeah, this sounds great. You mentioned the modifiability or customization that's possible with open source. Obviously, there's the fact that all of this is free. What else would speak for, or how would you? What's the most convincing factor other than this for companies to try open source, especially for security? Maybe. I mean, there's many open source software out there, but what makes security such a good area where this can be utilized?
Yes, so I think that one of the problem we see a lot is that upper management, especially at the board level, they are not yet very aware or sensitized to the need for cybersecurity. So cybersecurity risk is something that often are ignored, even if your CISO level people continue to say that there are certain possibilities of ransomware or some APTs sitting in your system, which might eventually do something. But we see, especially in India, we see that a lot of the executive level people don't take it seriously, and therefore the budgeting is very, very limited. Given the budgeting is limited, and they often treat the CISO as kind of a doomsday predictor with, don't take him very seriously, because I know for sure in my case, I am always very suspicious when people download things from like recently one of our PhD students in another department came to us. Her laptop with her thesis work and data got ransomware because she downloaded a cracked version of some kind of a plotting software. And I told her that, this is something you shouldn't do, right? So this is the situation that happens when your budget is very constrained, and therefore people get desperate and do various wrong things. Whereas if you are a very responsible CISO or CISO level personnel, then irrespective of the support, you might want to just protect what is your under your charge, and therefore they actually might be very happy to use this open source software, and then show that to the upper management that they are able to actually protect the system to quite a good extent, even though there might be other risks associated with open source software in terms of supply chain contamination, etc. But if they are careful, and it's a repository that has been well guarded, and maintenance of the code base is reputable, like the ones for Snort or Zik or Waza, for example, then or Security Onion for that matter, then you could actually be very more or less be confident that using them are very unlikely to actually harm them. So that's one of the reason why open source is interesting to such people.
Okay, and we've kind of been talking a lot about why people use open source, why it's a good tool, good for especially cybersecurity tools. But I was wondering, kind of, what are some of the limitations do you see of using open rather than closed source software in the context of security?
Right. So one of the things that, as I said, that supply chain contamination is a big concern. Mm-hmm. We have seen even the most well-guarded supply chain like SolarWind got contaminated and compromised, and therefore, and we have seen some GitHub repositories with Python scripts and all have been contaminated, and that's one thing that I think cybersecurity researchers need to focus on. And there has been some projects where people are actually applying these security analysis tools like SAS tools or task tools to actually evaluate security, publishing reports on open source security, this kind of things, and that needs to actually ramp up, because a lot of people are dependent on open source, and the community that actually spends their time and energy to build this open source resources are actually doing a great service to the humankind, and therefore they would like their systems to be secure. I mean, they don't want to have these contaminations there. The other thing that I feel might be a problem is that some organizations at the top management level might ban use of open source for various reasons, especially if influenced by vendors who might actually tell them otherwise about open and give them horror stories about some cases where open source was contaminated or the software was not efficient or effective enough. That happens.
Mm-hmm.
So some of them are time tested now already, and therefore they can be used. Some of them are new, and that has to be used very carefully. There are actors who would pose as a good guy and put a lucrative service on the GitHub or some repository, and you have to be careful about that. So, so there is a, you cannot blindly use open source, any tool that comes your way. You have to do your due diligence, be part of the various security discussion groups where you actually get a lot of inputs before you actually decide to download and deploy an open source thing. So I think if you do that, your risk is less, but there is no 100% security, as you know. So therefore, there is a possibility something can go wrong, and that might be some of the intimidation that CISOs might feel. This is a cultural thing that has to be addressed.
Okay, and does the fact that it is open and can, many people can use it and view the code bring any particular risk to using open source?
Yeah, so as I said, that there is risk. For example, a nation state attacker, right? So they actually buy all the security tools to do experiment on them and to find vulnerabilities in them, so that when they are going to attack a particular target, they actually are customizing their payload based on knowing the vulnerabilities, because all the tools, even commercial tools, have vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, in open source, that would be even easier, because you don't even have to buy. You can actually find the vulnerabilities and then use that to attack your system. So that risk is always there, other than the supply chain contamination risk that is also looming large. But so one has to do due diligence and figure out what are the vulnerabilities of the security tool itself, and accordingly have some mitigation methods. So I wouldn't say that it's easy. It requires cybersecurity knowledge, training, expertise to use the open source tools. It is not out of the box that you can just deploy. So I think to address this, we have to train more people with cybersecurity expertise and expose them to risks of open source and how to mitigate those risks and think about threat models that might be active if you use open source tools. So that is a long-term thing we are trying to do, but we'll see.
Okay, that's already quite interesting. You mentioned already two things. One being, staying informed about the technology that you're using, especially when you're using open source. You mentioned that there are some methods to test or validate this kind of software. Can you give us, in a nutshell, some of the best practices that you see and that you would recommend to organizations, individuals even, that want to build their IT infrastructure with open source?
Yeah, so I think I don't know about the other countries, but in India, the practice of risk assessment is almost missing, unless there is a regulatory requirement for being conforming to ISO 27001 or 62443. Well, 62443 is not very common in India, but 27001 is common. The question is, if you don't do risk assessment, then you don't know what is critical and what is less critical. I think that's the first thing you have to do, and then based on the criticality, you may or may not deploy open source in a very highly critical part and have a responsible vendor. You have to do your vendor research and find out like who will take responsibility in case their vendor software is breached. Whereas for the rest of the system, you can actually do open source, and before you do open source, you have to do risk analysis of putting the open source there. To do the risk analysis, you have to find vulnerabilities, find threats. That will require, as I was saying, that you have to be very informed about the technology, be part of these discussion groups and all that to actually be well informed. But these for small businesses, usually the risk is low. For example, there is let's say a cookie factory or some small factory that makes small parts of hinges, for example, door hinges or something, and they have a sort of little bit of automation system. Their risk is low, right? So no matter how you compute the risk is low. In fact, they take so much risk. Many of them are using Windows 7, even Windows XP. So they're so they're so tolerant to risk. So for them, if they want to improve their risk mitigation, then I would say use open source. Except that the question is, in such small companies, you don't have a cyber expert. So now in India, we are trying to create this ecosystem of startups. So our center has gotten grant from the government to create cybersecurity startups. Some of them could be these service startups. They will be actually doing service to implement cybersecurity in small and medium scale businesses, and they could actually do the view research of for open source risk and vulnerabilities and stuff, and go in and say that, okay, you can use this tool because we have done due diligence. There is a company also I recently read about, that their whole thing is about finding vulnerabilities and risks of open source security software. I cannot remember where I read it and remember but that means that there is a market. There is a market that actually is willing to use open source tools to actually implement their cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're talking about this, about having cybersecurity experts or like information available to companies you can't because they're quite small. So this month of October has actually been Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So yeah, we've been looking a lot at kind of how important cybersecurity awareness is. I just wonder if you want to talk a bit more about kind of cybersecurity awareness, how important it is, especially for those using open source tools to build their security infrastructure.
Yeah, so we are also, we have been actually given letters, government order to actually do events for cybersecurity. Yes. And we are doing a lot of webinars and web panels, etc. But it turns out that majority of the population don't even know what cybersecurity is. And also there is a misunderstanding even among educated people about what is cybersecurity, what is cybercrime, how they are related, things like that. In India, there is a lot of frauds that go on banking, mostly through social engineering. So we are trying to actually sensitize the social engineering aspects, because that's where most people get cheated, which is not exactly cyber attack, but it is cyber, somehow cyber enabled attack, I would say. And then I have been called to give talks on Cybersecurity Awareness Day at various organizations. All that stuff is going on, but I am still not happy about the awareness level. Even in organizations that are supposed to be guarding critical infrastructure, guarding banks in India are pretty good in terms of cybersecurity because so frauds is a different thing that is happening at the customer end. But if the bank cybersecurity, their information infrastructure, cybersecurity, 2005, our central bank made regulatory guidelines, and they have to abide by them. So I am pretty happy with the way the banks handle cybersecurity. They do a lot of work. They have very large teams, etc. Our Securities and Exchanges Exchange Commission, well, the equivalent of that is called SEBI, the Security Exchange Board of India. They also have, in 2016, they have done the similar guidelines, and those entities also have to do quite a bit, and they actually do have to audit, etc. So there you are basically being forced to do things by regulators. Whereas in other sectors, we are seeing that until the regulators come in, nobody wants to spend resources on cybersecurity. Even now, like one small bank manager, not a manager, board member, told me when I was giving a talk that I would rather pay the ransomware than pay large salaries for CISOs and large team of cybersecurity. They're always asking for resources and all this. So that kind of mentality is there. Government is also very unprotected, in my view, because of lack of cybersecurity awareness. Yeah, so I think the cybersecurity awareness is very important. Without that, no matter how much you do, it's at the customer end, they will be fooled, right? So that is required. Yeah.
That's an important message, I think. All right. Maybe before we close out, just quickly, talked a lot about open source software. For people who are interested and who actually want to look into this, do you have a few points where people can find out more, can learn more about these tools that you can recommend?
Well, our book has a lot of tools being used. The whole point of the book was to open source. Yeah, so I think that intrusion detection is one place where I find open source is highly mature. I find malware analysis, antivirus, open source is almost non-existent. Research have tools, like we also have tools, but it's not widely available. This is somewhere they have to spend money. There is also there are open source firewalls. There are open source web application firewall. There are I didn't see a lot of IPAM solutions in the open source, and then backup and recovery. That's where open source is almost non-existent. We have to spend money to solve that problem. VPNs, open source VPNs, I don't know of any. In fact, actually OpenVPN is there, but then eventually you have to get a robust VPN server. On the other hand, Tor is free, open source. So there are lots of tools. I think one has to get into some of this discussion groups. I think the discussion groups are the best way to know what is available, ask questions, and there would be a lot of willing people to answer. So I think that's the best way to go about it.
Okay, fantastic. And just finally, you mentioned that there's a few areas where there's slightly less open source software available. How do you see the future of open source software? Do you see it growing to fill in these gaps?
Yeah, I think that until the world becomes a lot richer, and until the cybersecurity becomes so important to board level, executives, I think that cybersecurity budgets will still be very low. And there I think you will see increasing use of open source. But there is a chance that there will be a large scale attack. Like, this week there was Twitch attack, one of the largest attack on streaming services with all customer data gone. There has been too many ransomware attacks in the last few months. So there is a palpable change of attitude towards cybersecurity, but it is hard. It is most board members are not cybersecurity or even IT people, and they don't see cybersecurity. They have other risks to worry about, like market risks and monetary risks and whatnot. So I think until that goes to that level of at the same level as other risks, I will think that the companies will starve in cybersecurity budgets, and then small scale businesses and stuff, they don't even have the wherewithal to actually buy expensive tools. And as long as the tool vendors put their price points that high, you will see use of open source. That's my hope. That's how it will be in the near future. But things might change over time.
Yeah. Well, that seems a perfect place to end it. So thank you very much, Sandeep, for joining us.
Thank you very much.